Taesok, a professional Baduk player, loses a game, and his brother meets the upset guy and asks him to play a game for him, and the stakes are very high. Taesok refuses at first, but his brother is persuasive. The men drive to a place Taesok does not know. His brother leaves, and the player is left in the company of a driver nicknamed Trix, who corrects the brother's play with a transmitter and an earpiece. Brother's opponent, Son Su, begins to suspect something strange. The man's moves are very unconventional. He offers to take his clothes off, but his brother says he doesn't like summer. The player replies that he, on the contrary, likes the cold. It turns out that the rival does not play himself either. He is guided by the old master, and the game is watched by the chief in the place, the lord of the underground clubs. And noticing that his brother is playing quite confidently, he exchanges the master for the young girl, Bae Kob. The game continues, but at this point Trix starts having intestinal problems and runs off to a nearby back alley. Taesok has to run the game himself. The weather deteriorates further and communication begins to fail. Taesok asks his brother to stall for time until the connection is restored, but he doesn't hear and makes a fatal move. At this point, Trix sees a thug walk up to the car, drag Taesok out and take him into the building, but there is nothing the man can do about it. In the hall, Taesok sees his brother stripped and realizes how the bandits found out about the transmitter. He begs for mercy, but then it turns out that the brother brought fake money to the game, which enrages the villains. One of them laughingly slaps Taesok, then stuffs his brother's sock with coins and starts beating him with that cudgel. The Lord enters and orders his brother to eat the game stones, threatening to kill Taesok, and then orders Taesok to sit at the board and fight him. If he wins, the Lord promises to let them live. Weeping, Taesok starts the game, but quickly loses. The Lord wounds Taesok, kills his brother, and puts the knife in the player's hand. Time passes. Once at prison, the warden, a big Baduk lover, tries to beat an elderly inmate, the local authority. He asks for a day off and bribes the warden with a large check, but the latter refuses because the authority has lost. Back in his cell, the man tries to analyze the game, but can't figure out where he went wrong. Taesok makes a remark at this point, after which the authority understands that the guy is a good player and asks him to beat his boss. Moreover, Taesok has to offer him a bet. Taesok complies with his request by betting the check received from the authority. If he wins, he asks to be released from his job. The men start the game, and Taesok wins, for which the angry boss puts him in the punishment cell. One day he finds a note in his food offering him a Baduk game, and immediately there is a knock on the cell wall. Taesok accepts the challenge and draws a playing field on the wall. Now he and his unknown neighbor play game after game, but Taesok invariably loses. He asks for at least the name of the unknown player, but instead finds another note in which his opponent thanks him for playing and tells him to find a player nicknamed God playing in one of the city districts after his release. After being released from solitary confinement, Taesok asks the authority to teach him how to fight, and his underlings take it upon themselves to train the guy. Now all Taesok's time is divided between playing with the boss and learning martial arts. Gradually, he reaches heights in everything and soon easily takes down several opponents at once, for which he thanks the authority. The day comes when Taesok's protector comes out and invites the boy to join his team after his release. Taesok asks for a loan. He agrees, hoping the guy will survive in prison without him. Meanwhile, a girl who is considered unique is brought to the lord of the gaming club. She is asked to solve a problem in Baduk, and she will be rewarded based on the solution she will offer. And the girl easily solves a very difficult problem. Her owner names a very high price. The lord gives the money and sends the girl away with his men. But after he leaves, the girl's owner sends his men with instructions to kill everyone and bring the girl back. The lord foresees this, so he waits for the murderer and cuts him, and then all of the lord's crew. Meanwhile, in one of the Baduk clubs, Bae Kob beats up a visitor. The gray-haired master makes fun of her, but the girl responds with hurtful remarks, which pleases the player who is present. The lord then gives her the girl and asks her to take care of the valuable acquisition. After serving his 7-year sentence, Taesok arrives at his dead brother's house and learns that his nephew is completely orphaned and now lives with his grandmother. He promises to come back for more and goes to the Baduk club. He tracks down a member of the gang of abusers who once counted his slaps and, pretending to be clumsy, offers him a Baduk game. He easily outplays Tae-sok and then offers to play for flicks, much to the man's amusement. Tae-sok decides to buy him out with change, but insists on sticking to the deal. The man, laughing, agrees, but after the first flick, he realizes he simply can't take 9 more. Angered, he snatches a knife, but Tae-sok ties him to a pillar and continues to beat him in the forehead until the man finally recognizes Tae-sok as his longtime victim. With one last flick, Tae-sok knocks the killer's eyes out. Meanwhile, Trix is playing Baduk with a player he knows and is caught cheating. He rushes away, and when he sees this, Tae-sok fights off the cheater. He recalls his brother and asks for his help in avenging the killers. He leads the man to the room he rented and shows him pictures of his enemies. Hearing the amount of the reward, Trix agrees, and the two go in search of the one advised by the unknown player from the nearby cell. They find the man on the street, but it turns out that God is blind, and yet he easily beats the amateurs, keeping all the moves in his head. Tae-sok asks for permission to learn from the master and sits down to play. Trix tries to figure out the master's secret, while Tae-sok loses the game. He invites God to the cafe table and asks about the cause of his blindness. It turns out that they both suffered from the same villains. Tae-sok asks for help, but the blind old man refuses. The next day, the company travels to the old player's daughter's house, and Tae-sok describes her view. After this excursion, God enters the game. He tracks down his former sidekick, now working as a carpenter, despite having once lost an arm. It turns out that this happened exactly after that game when they lost to the Lord. The carpenter agrees to join the team. Sometime later, Trix goes to the Baduk club owned by the Lord. In the club's secret rooms, the winnings count for millions, and it is very difficult to get to such a game. Only the strongest player is allowed to play against the Lord himself. Trix plays the perfect loser who loses money and collects data on all of the Lord's entourage. After getting all the information, Tae-sok goes to the club and gets to the same game table with the girl. She becomes interested in him, but can't remember where she's seen the guy. Jack of all trades, the carpenter prepares all sorts of technical stuff for secret clues and new documents for Trix, and he goes to the club. He is throwing money around, losing to everyone, and demanding that they bring him their favorite cigarettes. He behaves provocatively, reacts violently when he loses, and calls for the attention of the Lord's sidekick, the gambler. And Trix, using God's clue, wins the game, and not only gets his winnings back, but also takes his opponent's money. He deftly pulls out the earpiece and puts it in the crumpled cigarette packet to get rid of the evidence. The angry opponent calls to check on the cheater, but the guy is found to have nothing compromising on him. The player apologizes for the intemperate visitor and offers to play a game with him. Meanwhile, God reminds them of the concept of the divine move, which can only come up once in a lifetime, while Tae-sok plays with the girl and her associates. Suddenly, the Lord himself sits down at their table, but the guy doesn't pretend to know him. Later, the Lord interrogates Bakob about the new acquaintance, and she assures him that he is a common programmer. The Lord suspects that the girl likes the guy and beats her, but she reminds him of God's course. You never know what will happen, even the strong sometimes lose. The next day, the player receives an invitation to a party in the Trix van. He inspects the van looking for bugs, but finds nothing, because the video device is hidden on Trix himself, who dashingly distracts players' attention with constant chatter and silly antics. Then Trix wins, which infuriates the player. The gray-haired master laughs at him, and the guy asks for his help. He goes to the Trix van again, but now the master is playing for him, but he is unaware that the player himself, God, is playing for his opponent. Trix continues to chatter, distracting the player's attention, and wins. The infuriated player pulls out a knife, but at that moment Tae-sok enters the van, because he intends to pay back the old debt. A fight ensues. The old master, after seeing this, dashes off, but the carpenter and God catch up with his car and ram it. And Tae-sok, having finally knocked out the player, brings him into a large cold room. He locks the door with a combination lock and makes rules. Whoever wins gets out alive, especially since the player is a fan of the cold. The game begins while the temperature drops even lower, causing the bulbs on the walls to burst. Realizing that the player can't stand the cold any longer, he lunges at Tae-sok, but the latter beats his opponent, reminding him of his brother. Tae-sok then gives him a leaflet with a task. If he solves it, he will know the code to the lock and will be able to get out of there. Tae-sok himself goes to a cafe where he meets Bakob. He offers to play for a wish, and the pair sit down at the board. After winning, he kisses the girl, and she doesn't resist. Meanwhile, the Lord finds the player's body in the cold room. Then Tesok calls him, offering to play for their lives. In addition to the player, Tesok presents the Lord with the body of the Flick Lover hidden in the same cell. Enraged, the Lord goes to the Grey Master and finds him tied up. He orders the man to enter the game Tesok has challenged him to, the stakes of which must be Master's life. Despite resistance, the Grey Master is forced to accept the challenge. The game begins, and at first the Master wins. But suddenly, luck runs out, and the old man loses the game. Tesok offers to turn the board over if the Lord wants to know the names of his enemies. But to see the autographs, they must be covered in the Master's blood on cue. The gray-haired Master begs for mercy, but the Lord himself cuts off his tongue, splattering blood on the board. Immediately, a message appears, from which the Lord realizes that his enemy is very near. Looking out the window, he spots Tesok. In the evening, the Avengers team gathers for dinner, and the blind old man tells them that one day when he was sitting in the street, he was approached by a man who gave him a blind Baduk kit. They played for a year, and the stranger taught God a lot, but then he disappeared. Tesok thinks it was his cellmate, because when he tried to see his face, he noticed that the cell walls were clear, which meant he was playing blind. The Lord has heard that such a master lives in the city of Busan, but knows nothing else. At this time, the Lord sees the camera footage of Backup making out with Tesok, and the Lord asks Trix to clean him up. He shaves the man, takes him to a store where he buys new clothes, and then takes him to his daughter's house. But on the doorstep of the building, they are grabbed by the Lord's handmaidens. The pair are led to him. The blind man is seated behind the board, and the battered Trix is suspended in a position where he can only reach the floor with his fingertips. The Lord invites Trix to solve the problem given by Tesok to his player, and when he makes a mistake, he breaks his fingers. The last attempt ends in success, which prolongs Trix's life for now. The Lord calls Tesok. He finally remembers him and offers to play for his life. In the meantime, he plays with his friends. The Lord sits down at the board and calls the moves, and Trix moves the stones. None of them know that Backup and the girl are playing for the Lord. God starts to win, but the girl makes an ingenious move and the friends lose. The Lord stabs God, pinning his palm to the board with the last blow. At this time, Tesok comes into the hole. Seeing God bleeding, he throws him onto Sagrib Tag, and the Lord, pointing at Trix, promises to let him live if Tesok wins. Meanwhile, the friends take God out to the car, where he asks his friend not to play with the bandit. It looks like the genius kid is playing for the Lord. Then he dies. Meanwhile, the Lord orders Backup and the girl to play at full strength, or they will both die. The girl recalls how they discussed the game with Tesok, and he told her what he needed to win. Tesok returns to the building, while the Lord tells her to kill Sagrib Tag. The game begins. And the carpenter, with an axe bolted to the stump of his hand, begins the fight in the parking lot. Tesok makes move after move, while the Lord warns that if he wins, Backup will die. She gives secret signs to the girl, and she does as your friend says, playing along with Tesok. And then the unthinkable happens. The players get a draw, which never happens in Baduk. The Lord tells him to bring in Backup, and Tesok promises to show an unprecedented game, to which the Lord stabs the girl and then rushes at his opponent. Tesok engages in combat with the Lord's underlings. Eventually, the enemies are left one-on-one. The Lord is ready to stab Tesok, but he dodges the knife at the last moment, and the fight continues until Tesok has the dagger with which the Lord took his friend's life in his hand. He strikes his opponent and pins his palm to the board. Exhausted, Tesok sits against the wall and looks around the terrifying battlefield, and lying back up when the girl appears before him. Sometime later, the boy comes to the daughter of God and gives her a large check from her father. Then he visits his nephew, gives him new things, and asks him to solve problems on his new phone. When he arrives at Sagrantag's house, he sees him carving a bust of God and goes to the place where he played Baduk. He commemorates his friend by pouring a glass of his favorite drink and dipping pebbles from the game into it. Later, a car stops in front of him, with Trix sitting at the wheel and Backup, and the girl genius smiling from the back seat. The company is about to visit Busan to find one man.